Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the Suburban Pathfinder. I'm up at camp once again, and I've been here for about 3 days, and we've been getting a lot of chores and cleanup done. I brought a whole duffel bag full of knives with me with the intention of doing a bunch of videos, and hopefully I'll get a few more produced, but we've been a bit busier with mundane tasks than I had anticipated. So we'll see how things go over the next couple of days. There is one video I would like to produce for sure while I'm here, because it's really only when I'm here at camp that I have the opportunity to produce this video. And as I'm sure most of you have already read the title of the video, I want to take a look at the difference between the old Becker knife and tool BK9 combat bowie and the newer version from K-Bar. And the reason I can really only do this when I'm here is that this one belongs to me, and this somewhat newer but maybe even more beat up one belongs to my dad. And my dad's a little bit more pragmatic than I am about his tools. He's not quite as much of a knife enthusiast as I am, and he leaves this one hanging in the woodshed like a $3 Harbor Freight machete. So it's really only when I'm up here that I have a chance to look at this particular knife. But I do want to cover a little bit of the backstory of the Becker BK9 and knives like it. For most of the 20th century, I would say from the turn of the last century up through most of the 20th century, including a lot of my younger years, my formative years, there was a general philosophy of whatever you want to call it. Today, people call it bushcraft. It used to be referred to as woodcraft or fieldcraft. I think of most of these knives as field knives. I kind of bristle at the term bushcraft. I have used it in the past. I'm going to continue to use it, but I think it's overused. But the philosophy of the old timers was that anyone who showed up out in the woods with a big honking ass knife like this one was automatically labeled a greenhorn. You clearly didn't know what you were doing. This was something that was sold to guys that were headed out into the wilderness who had no idea what they were doing. They thought, oh, I need a big knife. And the salesman very happily sold them one. And true woodsmen, true outdoorsmen knew that all you needed to survive in the wilderness was the smallest knife possible, very lightweight. And again, I subscribe to this philosophy. I didn't want to be labeled a greenhorn. This is actually the very first knife that I ever built. And you can see this is a little caping knife. And yeah, I didn't always take care of it as best I should. It's got a couple of rust spots on there. But this was the first knife I ever built, and it's only got about a 2-inch blade. And for sure, you can do an awful lot of outdoor tasks with a knife like this. And then that would be augmented with a small belt axe. This is the Fiskars X7. Not very traditional, but it is a good axe. I've used this one quite a bit. I had another one. Not sure exactly what happened to that. This one I've had about 2 years, and I've split up a fair amount of kindling. So with a very small knife and a small belt axe, you could do all the tasks you needed to do in the outdoors and be perfectly fine. Now, bushcraft philosophy, whether you're talking about the early 20th century with guys like Kephart and Nessmuck and these other guys, they almost formed a religion around woodcraft or fieldcraft. And today, bushcraft has almost taken on a sort of religious fervor. People are very firmly set in their ways. But today we have a much more diverse philosophy. There are still people who subscribe to the idea of the little knife and a small belt axe is all you need. But around the time of, I would say, the late 1980s, the early 1990s, going into the early 2000s, a new idea came out. And that idea was that maybe instead of having the small belt axe, you have a big chopper. Not quite like this one, although you could do some serious chopping with this knife. And I actually just got done building this one, and I do intend to do some chopping with it. But people started designing new knives, big choppers as they came to be known, and there are a bunch of different ones on the market today. But one of the real pioneers in this field was Ethan Becker. And Ethan Becker started Becker Knife and Tool, and I think the very first knife that he designed was the Machax, which was sort of a combination between a small hatchet and a kukri knife. He developed a couple of other knives. I think what is known today as the BK2 was at that point known as the Becker Companion, and it had this immensely thick blade, about 5 inches long, a very simple, straightforward butcher-style blade, but very thick and capable of chopping. And he continued to develop new knives in his series, eventually arriving at the BK9, and I think there may be even some that came after the BK9 now. Now, when Ethan Becker started Becker Knife and Tool, he was having his knives produced by, I think, a couple of different small manufacturers. Later on, he contracted with the original incarnation of blackjack knives. Again, I'm out in the middle of the wilderness. I don't have access to the internet. But the guy who started blackjack knives is the guy who currently owns Bark River Knives and who also produces the current generation of blackjack knives. But that original iteration of blackjack knives in Escanaba, Michigan, I think, they went under sometime in the late 1990s. At that point in time, Becker Knife and Tool went to Camillus, who is probably the largest cutlery manufacturer in the United States, and reintroduced his BK&T knives and tools using Camillus's extensive manufacturing capabilities. Camillus, I think, actually had their own smelting. They made their own steel alloys, and these were in production for about 10 years. I think it was 2007, Camillus was struggling, and they eventually went under. Ethan Becker was able to negotiate the repurchase of Becker Knife and Tool name and the designs from the Camillus bankruptcy. And I think it was in 2007, he then approached Ka-Bar, who was probably the second biggest, or maybe now the biggest knife manufacturer in the United States, and reintroduced the Becker Knife and Tool series under Ka-Bar's name. So the Camillus Beckers and the current Ka-Bar Beckers are the two most common forms of the Becker Knife and Tool series knives that you're going to find out there today. The very early sort of prototypes that were made by smaller manufacturers have become way too collectible and valuable to self-described Becker heads. They're mostly in people's collections. I think even the blackjack era knives are worth a lot of money now and are mostly in people's collections. And they were never produced in enormous numbers, not like these. So these you're going to see. The others, not so much, at least not out in the woods. And these two knives are extremely similar, as you can see from a distance. But there are a remarkable number of differences between these two knives. And first of all, being the steel. The current Ka-Bar knives are made from 1095 Crovan, which is, as the name suggests, 1095 carbon steel modified with a certain amount of chromium and vanadium. The earlier Camillus knives were made from Camillus's steel, and that alloy number escapes my memory at the moment, but it was marketed. Camillus was making steel and making blades for Cold Steel at the time, and Cold Steel marketed this steel alloy as Carbon V. Now, Cold Steel trademarked the Carbon V name, and they would not allow Camillus to use it, even though Camillus was the company that was producing the steel. But this is pretty much the same as that. You can think of the old cold steel Trailmaster in carbon V. Well, actually, the Trailmaster is still in production. I'm not sure what kind of steel they're using in it today. Probably 1095 Crovan or something very similar. But this is a very well-respected steel. Some people will tell you that 1095 Crovan is a bit superior to the old carbon V. Some people believe that carbon V is superior. I'm not a metallurgist. I don't really know. They both seem to be very good knives. Ethan Becker himself, now, he's in business with K-Bar. His opinion that he's expressed publicly in forums is that K-Bar's heat treatment and their alloy is somewhat superior to the old Camillus heat treat and alloy, but, you know, who knows? I think it's a really tight race when it comes to the steel and the heat treatment. There are some fairly significant dimensional differences, as well as a bit of difference in the grind of the two blades and the markings. And I don't know, maybe somebody else has done a video similar to this, but I want to turn the camera around onto the bench top and take a closer look at these two knives, just to see what the differences are. I think functionally there's not a lot, but there's enough to make it kind of interesting. So let's take a look at it. So first of all, here are the two sheaths. This is the older sheath for the Camillus BK9. Both of these I'm not a huge fan of, to be perfectly honest with you. They've got plastic liners. They're very rattly. As one might imagine, the knives have a 9-inch blade. The sheath hangs down quite far. If you put either of these on your belt and have it slapping off your thigh all day long, you're not going to be super happy about it. Both of them have leg tie downs. Well, this one I added in. I think my dad's probably came with a leg tie down already on it. They're both kind of flimsy Cordura nylon, although, again, both of them do have a hard liner inside. They've both got these Velcro pockets on the front. Seems like I have something in here. Oh yeah, I've got a little fire steel in here. Little magnesium block with a ferro rod on it. I'm not going to try to get that back in the pocket. The hardware is kind of cheap. I may have had this around salt water at some point in time. These brass grommets down here have turned pretty green. These are kind of crusty. And the snap on this one has rusted and a bit of the paint has flaked off. There's not a whole lot of difference with the K-Bar version. It is a little bit more rigid, which is kind of nice than this very, very floppy material. The hardware seems like it might be a little bit better. One thing that is nice about the K-Bar, well, there's a couple of things that are nicer about the K-Bar sheath. This piece of webbing strap that covers the pocket on the front is made out of a finer material. This has that really open weave that has a tendency to get snagged on thorns and get picks in it, although this one's holding up pretty well. The other thing I do like about the K-Bar sheath is that the plastic liner inside has a flared mouth to make it easier to insert the knife into the sheath. The Camillus does not have that, but it works fine. Either of these is an okay carrying case, neither of which I would hang on my belt. Both of them, I think I just put the knife into the sheath and then stuff it down in my backpack. That's about all I can say for these. I'm sure you could do much better if you went and got a custom Kydex maker to perhaps make you a better sheath than either of these. And now onto the knives themselves. This is the original. Well, actually, I guess this is the third generation after the limited production run knives and then the blackjack knives. This is the Camillus version, and here you can see this is the K-Bar version, which is more or less the current iteration. I think there are some changes with the newer knives, but I don't have a newer knife to look at. So first of all, you can see there are some differences in the grind. The swedge on the K-bar is much more substantial, much broader, whereas the flat grind of the saber grind is narrower on the K-bar than it is on the Camillus. It comes up much further here. The angle, I think, is roughly similar, however, because the Camillus is made out of slightly thicker stock than is the K-bar. Again, I'm out in the wilderness and I don't have access to a caliper or a micrometer, but the K-bar is definitely made from slightly thinner stock than the Camillus. Likewise, the glass reinforced nylon grip panels on the K-bar are a bit thinner than those on the Camillus, and that just gives you an overall smaller grip. The K-bar feels a little bit weird to me. I'm just not used to it. It's not a bad grip, but it's much, much smaller. The Camillus feels more natural to me because, as you can see, I've been using this for about 20 years, and I'm just very accustomed to this grip. Both knives have very similar thumb ramps with very similar jimping that you can use to get better pressure on the blade when you're doing finer tasks. And both knife scales are held onto the blade in the same fashion. We've got Allen socket cap head screws on one side, and then hexagonal recesses in the grip frames that hold little steel nuts, and those just screw together. That's nice. You can adjust them or replace them in the field. You don't need to get any special hardware. You could find these cap screws at just about any well-equipped hardware store. So, I really like the Becker BK9. This was the first big chopper that I had. I wanted to try it out, but I was a little bit leery about using it. But it's made from beefy enough stock that it really works well for batoning. I generally don't do a lot of batoning on larger pieces of firewood. I'll generally take care of larger firewood with a big axe or a splitting maul. Mostly I will baton small pieces of wood into kindling, and the Becker BK9 is really, really good at that. Now, because of the relatively shallow full flat grind, well, it's not really full flat. I guess this is a saber grind, but the blade is so broad, you end up with an edge or a geometry that's very similar to a full flat grind. You can still put a very fine edge on the BK9, and it's still reasonably good at more fine tasks like feather sticking. It's not a feather sticking monster. You're not going to shave up a million super fine, hair thin feathers off of a stick, but you can make usable tinder to get a fire started. And another thing that the BK9 is extremely good at, because of its significant weight, is chopping. I've chopped down some small trees with the Becker BK9. Obviously, you can cut firewood, smaller firewood, to length very easily with the BK9. When you have very small branches that you want to cut into kindling, it just chops through them with virtually no effort whatsoever. So there are some differences between the K-bar BK9 and the Camillus BK9, but from a practical standpoint, I think both of these are really outstanding knives, and you can't go too far wrong with either of them. So while the Camillus incarnation of the Becker BK9 and the K-bar version are somewhat different in dimensions, a little bit heavier and beefier with the Camillus, maybe a little bit better steel and heat treatment with the K-bar, and actually perhaps a little bit more ergonomic as my hands get more and more arthritic, I actually like a fatter grip. It allows my fingers to bend more easily and for me to grip the grip a little bit more easily. But I think probably for many people, particularly younger people, the K-bar is actually going to feel a little bit better in the hand. It just feels weird to me because I've used the Camillus so much. But my dad has used this one quite a bit, really smashed up the blade, and it has taken a beating and continues to work. So if you're looking at buying a Becker BK9, particularly an older one, because even this version of the K-bar is not what's being sold today. I don't think they're doing any roll marking on the blades anymore. I think the current markings are all laser etched onto the blades. Not that that makes much of a difference. But if you're looking at buying an older BK9 as a big chopper, I don't think you could go very far wrong with either of these knives. I know for a fact that both of these have taken an enormous beating. Again, I reprofiled the edge on mine a bit, and it's holding up quite well. My dad's appears to, I imagine he's probably touched this up, but this appears to still have the factory edge on it. And even after having been beaten on with hammers or rocks or whatever, it's still pretty much, yeah, it'll still shave some thumbnail there. Still very, very sharp. And my dad's probably had this one 10 years, whereas I've had mine more like 20 years. But they've both been beat to hell, and they're both holding up really nicely. So I think that's about as ringing an endorsement as I can give. I am going to try to produce a couple more videos before the end of the week. I want to take a look next at some new bushcraft knives that I have, and some of the older field knives that I've been using in the woods for years. I'm switching some things up. I want to play around with comparing some of my older stuff with some of my newer stuff. And so I'm going to try to get at least another 2 or 3 videos produced this week before I have to go home. So when I do that, I hope to see each of you here then. Later, guys.